Hello everyone, today we talk about the Indian armored infantrymen of the Mauryan era. For some reason people don't watch Indian history on my channel, but we cover it, if anything, for any need of completion that this encyclopedic content requires. At the same time, it's actually a very interesting topic. Then again, different cultural reasons bring people to sort of not to care about it very much. On Schwerpunkt, as you know, we mostly make military historical analysis, in particular art of war study. We discuss strategic culture, so it's actually quite relevant, if not necessary, to discuss these topics if you want to have any term of comparison with other peoples at the same time. We talk about Rome, we talk about China. We really made lots of videos about medieval Asia in general, not so much about India, however, in particular. That is truly a universe, like a subcontinent, in fact, on its own. And it does have actually a pretty complex military culture, as well as a pretty developed one, right? It is true, some sort of sense that Indian civilization, for different reasons, was not really as advanced as Rome or China. But at the same time, we're definitely looking at some of the most sort of advanced sanitary cultures in the world at the time, and it deserves all the attention needed. We talked about Indian infantry of the same period. Today we discussed mostly like between the 4th, the 2nd century BC. This is a historical military unit series for our sort of broadened Hellenistic era period. We also talked about ancient Indian tactics, army organization, war elephants, right? That was yet another historical military unit series. Today we talk about the heavier infantry, right? Telling the truth, we should divide always, because many sort of war games texts have insinuated sort of people's minds this misconception that essentially heavy or light infantry depends as a definition on the basis of how heavily armored you are, right? Which is not actually the case. When we talk about heavy infantry in general, we're talking about any infantry that basically fights in a full formation, right? In a compact battle line that can hold the ground against cavalry. And even though, of course, there is a sub-segmentation, in this case, we're looking at probably the best, the most heavily armored Indian infantrymen. It's not like those can't hold the ground, right? Again, between each other, there are different factors. If we were to talk about missiles, we would speak of light infantry. At most, what the videos we already made about sort of more common Indian infantry is essentially the lesser armored one, if anything. There's also an evolution historically. I don't think I'm going to cover, but I should make a video perhaps to fill the gap about Bronze Age Indian warfare, right? It would be very interesting. Also connecting with our Vedic history of religion content. In any case, conceptualizations aside, they are always useful to make for this kind of videos, and we will explain now why. Of course, there is a pretty sort of average type of trooper that we can reasonably approximate being armored infantrymen of the Mauryan era, right? These approximations are necessary in the sense that, obviously, as we will see now, the entire video revolves mostly around philological issues rather than strictly military ones. Given that the issue is that, first of all, India is not overwhelmingly documented. We've seen this dreadfully being the case for medieval warfare at large as well, which in and of itself is part of the sort of the aforementioned indicators of general lesser development, greater sort of political instability, less statal development. India is also huge, so it really depends what we're talking about. Some places were very advanced, and as such, they could field heavier troops, better equipped ones, also statally armed by some degree. However, it's still normally very aristocratic and privatized system. So from a military point of view, and that's the part of India that, frankly, is also more representative of the whole. From a numerical point of view, hierarchically, we can't talk now. So sort of more heavily armored elements connected with more developed forces, with larger elements of picked elite troops. So the video revolves around the fact that unfortunately we don't know much about Indian armor during this period, so we have to fall back on literally religious texts, right, of even the Vedas themselves, for sort of a glimpse on what the Indians would have depicted themselves at this point in history as warriors, and how they were armed, and so on. The guy that I chose here, by the way, is as a model for the military historical series that revolves around normally very specific evidence, mostly iconography and archaeological types, is from the city of Kushinagar, right? We have this 5th century BC, according to a 1st century BC, right? Rather, frieze in Sanchi Stupa. This is the number 1 southern gate, right? And actually, like, reliefs in and of themselves, as we just stated, are sort of complicated to date without other references of other monuments, right? And this is also a very famous source, is the one I've used iconographically, talking about the Mauryas in general, because there is a quite wide array of troop types, including these guys, as we'll see now, also from the pictures, with a literal, what looks like a segmented armor protecting their abdomen rather than chest, right? Segmented armor was a thing from a very long time. Like, the Romans didn't invent it themselves, which doesn't actually mean anything. Like, they mastered it anyway. Also before the 1st century BC, when it starts spreading, also from Caesar times onwards in the Roman military, there had been, we know actually, previous, the Romans had already used it in some ways, not in the way it became more fully known, but in the Hellenistic world there was segmented armor. You can find that in the reliefs of the altar of Pergamon. I think about the Seleucid cataphract, sort of armored arm bands. And actually, that's a solution you can find back even properly to the early Mesopotamian civilization. Now, the problem, even though we have pretty, as you see also from the pictures, pretty good info about about the existence, right, of this type of armor, we don't know exactly how it was constructed. Naturally, armor types actually came out in old kind of material. We know it very well for the same so-called lorica segmentata. It was not called like that, for that matter, at the time. The accent is lorica, telling the truth. I often said lorica, but it doesn't actually change much. It's more like the Italian version of the same. In any case, we know that case segmented armor could be made in bronze. This is a discovery from just a few years ago. There surely was some leather type of armor here and there next to the more common iron at that point. So now we will not be discussing this very much, because also archaeological finds are scarce. So, does it matter? Really, we already know that was the case. Our interest here is more strictly military historical. It is to say, what can we get away from this type of evidence in general, and the literary texts that we were discussing before. Naturally, there were all probably types of plate armor, corselets, as you know, in the Bronze Age, that had been importantly a thing. We don't think the Indians fought in any particularly different way compared to other cultures. at the time. They had their own distinctive traits that we try to outline, and considering the very big Indian armies. In particular, we'll surely come back on that. We'll talk about the Battle of the Hydaspes at some point, also considering we have a series on Alexander in Afghanistan that is sort of relatively close from the Hindu Kush into India. Like that's exactly the crossing. In any case, we know, of course, an important amount of information about Indian warfare from Western sources, as it continues also in the later centuries. We can hypothesize different types of heavily armored guy. In fact, as you've probably seen here, I inserted also another version of kilted cotton armored guy, right? That has this type of armor. We'll discuss it. There are also some Hellenistic influences in the Metallurgies and so on. Was surely employed in some ways. Padded armor was probably sort of slightly more common that we tend to represent in pop culture. There is an aggressive debate regarding how much, that also the Romans do not sort of show in sort of too explicit terms such kind of padded garments, but we kind of understand and know that they were there by an important degree. Armor was naturally not standardized in the way that it would be later. The term standard or uniform may sound anachronistic to some, but technically just means that you're upheld to a certain, in fact, minimum standard. And surely troop types were issued a specific type of weapons. But as I said before, in armor, as we said before, there was a lot of customization just per se. I mean, the most regularly permanent, so to say, professional units that accessed equipment from, for example, palace arsenal, something like that. We're not talking about the private retinues of the great Indian rural landowners, etc. But as we were saying just at the beginning, the idea that therefore equipment could radically vary along sort of such different lines is not entirely correct, right? It's like when you see, for example, the development of the Roman legionnaire. You know that the Romans evidently had issued some standard equipment, but if you really look at the average type of warrior in sedentary Europe, aside from the fact that the Romans could perhaps armor their troops better. In fact, it's not even entirely clear how uniformly armored Roman legionaries were within the same legion, or even within the same court, etc. The sort of average warrior with, a noble shield, couple of javelins / spears, some sort of helmet, and if it was like some greater type of armor, is pretty much identical everywhere. In fact, the Indians are slightly different, apparently at least, because Europe is also particularly calibrated, right? Maybe the Iranian mountaineer infantry looked slightly more similar to the European one compared to the Indians, but we could never really say, especially considering the broader diversity of the subcontinent. So having made these very much needed premises, because we will be partly repeating this stuff as we expose the evidence, let's look at the evidence itself, in fact. So, as we pointed out, the depiction of the ancient Indian armored infantryman as gleaned from various sources presents this really complex picture, where literary, artistic, and foreign accounts provide both complementary and contradictory details that, however, do not really create much problems in absolute terms. Again, there are certain standard types of troops that come into being just because of the needs of sedentary pre-industrial societies, right? So again, the over-characterization of troops in general is not overly necessary. We can understand why, the average heavy infantryman, in terms of, again, a guy with a spear and a shield and barely any armor, as we've seen in the other video, would be there, as it's also represented in Indian art, right? Here we look at the armored guys, more heavily armored guys in general. Now, the equipment of the soldiers, even as early as the Rig Veda period, so this is the earliest layer of Vedic literature, composed roughly between 1500 and 1200 BC in the northwestern Indian subcontinent. There was, in this sense, more exposed also to some important military developments from the steppes in particular that had been dominating, especially chariot warfare. At that point, we'll come back on this stuff. Included a coat of mail, helmet, and arm guard. Right? We're told properly by these texts. In fact, Varuna, the Vedic deity associated with cosmic order, waters, and moral law, who oversees the universe from his celestial abode and is often paired with Mithras, is described as wearing golden mail of lustrous appearance surrounded by spies. So here we don't have to reflect on, the golden mail, etc. We have essentially to, appreciate mail. That is something which in fact starts appearing really from this time onwards. Consider that texts here, there's all a literary problem of how they were handed down, what kind of sort of later information was introduced, or terms used to describe things. So I'm not going to enter specifically in that. But that's a very interesting detail, for example, because mail will eventually spread a bit across the entire Indo-European world, but we mostly associated with the nomadic steppes. Even though, telling the truth, some of the earliest evidence, right, not even just like the Scytho-Celtic one of the Carpathians, but is to be found actually in Etruscan Italy. We'll come back on the origins of sort of armor. It doesn't really mean much because the evidence is so scarce, but we know obviously that at the time they made substantial use of different gear that for some reason did not survive, etc. What we care about here is that, of course, and this is also, you see, we could even do without this evidence, that of course, at this point, every elite trooper would have been heavily armored, right, with metal, etc. When we think about the Bronze Age and gilded armor, if anything, like, we can think, again, the Age of Heroes. As you know, the Vedas were pretty much like the exponential incarnation of this. And again, we really need to go back to Bronze Age warfare. We'll cover something like hopefully soon. Now, the epics, such as the Mahabharata, the massive Sanskrit epic traditionally attributed to Vyasa that narrates the Kurukshetra war between the Pandavas and Kauravas and contains extensive didactic section on dharma, statecraft, and warfare, and Ramayana consistently portray heroes and nobles donning armor, often described as made of gold, but also, because also the scanning of the various ages, it's sort of different metaphysical rank, silver, copper, or iron, sometimes decorated with precious metals as well. For instance, during the fight between the king of Virata and Susarma, all soldiers wore coats of mail, with Virata's brother Satanika sporting one of adamant ornamented with gold. Satanika means exactly what you think, as a sort of titanic figure in the sense that challenges, all right? And his eldest son, Sankarsana, wearing well-tempered iron as well, right? So we have also a pretty clear array of obviously metal armor in the same Vedic tradition, worn by units like the chieftains, right? The heroes, the retinues. It's completely normal. The great warrior Kirpa's armor was made of tiger skin, apparently. And so you start here getting also in something more strictly local and ethnic, again, tempered by local sensitivities, so to say. We already made multiple videos on modern Indian warfare, not just Mughal. And we've seen that, of course, in the fringes of India at the time, and you can imagine more primitive times in antiquity, there was a lot of tanned, sort of lot of leather armor, right? So this is really unsurprising. Naturally, tiger skin is also a bit like, think about the berserkers, the Ulfatnar, etc., proof of having slain a formidable and sort of divine creature in holy combat, is of being able to sort of absorb that power, like just like after having slain the dragon. This is also very universal, very obvious. Lots of tigers in India. There should be more, frankly. But even imagine at the time, I mean, there were lions, still by Augustus times in places like Spain or Italy, right? So you can imagine what India looked like by the way at the time, as far as this game was concerned. And of course, like the great hunts of the tiger in India, also an elephant back that was taming the massive chthonic monster as well. And that's why, in fact, a great deal of combat is also shown, not just on horseback, that by the time of the sacred Indian text was not really fully developed as an actual arm of cavalry, but later on, definitely. India has actually a very strong cavalry tradition that gets always overlooked, I would say. But naturally, more sort of glamorous is the elephant, right? And again, I made those videos on Mauryan tactics and army organization that try to make sense, in fact, of how the various arms interacted, also from a quantitative point of view, and in the array battle, the battle array. And we don't know 100% like how things were. There are texts actually in India that recount us how things were in the olden times, etc., but they are very symbolical, right? You can't take them as simple matter of fact. So here we are just looking at hints fundamentally. Now, the Duryodhana wore a formidable helmet. The Jayadratha had a gold plate broken by Saubhadra's sword. So again, you have all these mythological figures and clans that fought against one another with this precious gear. Ordinary soldiers are occasionally noted as armored, with finger guards made of antelope skin and bracelets of bull's hide, as seen in the Mahabharata. This is also very interesting due to archery. You need to protect your fingers, your wrists, right? So this is, think about Arjuna and sort of the role that the bow has, as you see also in this iconography I prepared for you today, because we're talking about heavy infantry, but there is, in fact, an interesting touch of champion/heroism in the still relatively, in a sense, primitive and archaic Indian warfare. So namely this double equipment at a point with bows and hand-to-hand weapons, swords, right? And you see it again in the stupa reliefs, but I also mixed here in the model something from the both of it, like archers that can unseat their swords. So we're not looking at, again, missile troops, but so to say heavy missile troops that in the sense can also engage in melee. And this was proper of the hero, because, by the way, we'll see now this better, there's a lot of mounted and chariot warfare still. Right, chariot warfare lasts in India longer, more systemically, than, say, I don't know, Mesopotamia. All right, still by sort of the common era, there were chariots in Indian warfare. Naturally, they had started declining themselves, but the idea is also that Indian infantry is numerous, but not quite consistent. So chariots actually have, especially in some great plateaus in the north, in the major valleys, are really effective in smashing into enemy formations. There are also elephants, etc. So that modulates, plasmates the plasticity, the physicality of the battlefield, right? And there is, again, this idea that the Indian subcontinent is fundamentally spent in terms of sort of masses, forces. This is not Europe, so to say. Naturally, there were some good infantries, but evidently chariot warfare was not challenged, right, until almost a millennium later, unlike what happened with the Sea Peoples coming from Europe in places like the same Levant to basically bring an end to chariot primacy, right? So you have already Assyrian warfare developing pretty sturdy infantries. You have, the Urartians. You have the same Argos panoply, and eventually what we know as the classical Hellenic phalanx, eventually adopted as proper tactics. If you look at the Hellenic etymology of the term as an order, all over the West, as a matter of fact. We'll come back on that topic too, because it's quite fascinating. But these guys, described especially in the Vedic epos, are champions. Naturally, in heroic warfare that did exist, however, there was never something just like a simple duel, right? Ideally, things could be settled in that manner, but more practically, even in most heroic, sort of systemically heroic times, the hero is always followed by a retinue. These are clan leaders, right? They fight together sort of with their tribe. They have retinues, and they go ahead because they're the most, like in this case, heavily armored elements of the force, but they are always supported by lighter troops, right? And the archer, that's why I brought up the chariot thing, as we'll see now better from other anecdotes, is not just that the hero in Vedic tradition is a charioteer as well, but in this sense, as we've seen also in the videos about Bronze Age warfare, aside from probably the driver that is a subordinate, the hero, when on chariot, mostly is not simply sort of engaged in hand-to-hand combat. He can dismount, fight, and remount. We know this also from Celtic warfare. But mostly he shoots with his bow, right? And so that is actually quite relevant. And again, the bow has some sort of slightly different role in Asia compared to Europe, also in this heroic literature. Additionally, just go back to the scriptures. When Bharata met Rama, Gua, the lord of the Nishadas, essentially like a forest-dwelling tribal group often associated with the Ganges region and known for their boating and hunting skills, prepared his followers with male accoutrements, mistaking Bharata for an enemy in this sense. So showing that this more savage people sort of didn't know that more heavily armored face. And this is very archetypal because, again, these are the forest people, so the fringe ones, the chthonic ones, right? And given that the main heroes are obviously of the Deva descent, and they are thus associated with the Aryans and with those who had pioneered chariot warfare, and so also the more heavily armored elite mechanism came with that essentially feudal system. There is literally an ethno-cultural divide, military-wise, in gear and tactics, etc., between these two populations, right? So that the hero, as we've seen also in the videos about Indo-European theology, literally molds the words in his own image, crossing with a chariot and ordering the world. And these peoples live in the darkness instead around. They don't know that kind of magnificence. Naturally, here the armor is intended as a spiritual quality. So we're seeking for a material term that in the text is actually not truly associated with the idea of being enhanced by some form of material capacity, like a technological trick, so to say. The golden armor is basically indicating the divinity of the wearer, not some sort of cowardly Promethean mean of defense per se. But obviously, the same literature mirrored what already by the time which was written, handed down, knew, of course, this armor in the development of the same in the art of war. And so it's quite fascinating to find this divide ethno-anthropologically in the texts. The Arthashastra, the ancient Indian treatise on statecraft, economics, and military strategy attributed to Kautilya or Chanakya, who served as advisor to Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire around late 4th century BC, provides a detailed catalog of armor types, emphasizing their variety and materials. right? This is particularly important because it's a later source, and it speaks of some, in fact, of the most important times in Indian, we could say, tendentially imperial, ecumenic history. We'll talk more about Chandragupta Maurya and his attempt at establishing, in fact, some also more orderly, centralized, state-supplied military. Right, this is the great problem in India. Like, it's stabilizing a civilized structure. Right, this gets routinely instead engulfed and swallowed by the greater chthonic exuberance of of the land, both demographically and agriculturally, because those who lead those are still more traditionally actually the elites, right, in a truly feudal sense. Whereas what Chandragupta was doing was, again, state is different. So there is always this lingering divide, and this does create some problem in the interpretation of the sources, because the idea is that the rural aristocracy was actually less represented in, for example, the great central state monuments, etc., given that they represented properly an antithetic model. And at the same time, they were Spartan enough not to care to represent themselves more than much. And we were talking, as I was saying before, this also in medieval warfare, because India's iconography in particular is very conservative, right? Very primitive. It stylizes and sort of simplifies. The Arthashastra lists armor made of metal rings or plates, horn plates from animals like tortoise, rhinoceros, bison, elephant, and cow, as well as patterned cotton, and more of that later, by the way. We should point out, brief spoiler, for two reasons, that there is Hellenistic influence in Indian warfare, as much as Persian influence, because the Achaemenids actually at some point invaded India. I'm preparing a video about this. I think in general people know of this expedition that was not sort of entirely successful, so to say. And so you find even the same Chandragupta at some point having received some very substantial Macedonian Achaemenid influence at some point in life, at least also in part according to legend. And there was a big deal of injections, again, also from the steppes, etc., also from the ancestral Indian background, etc. So you can imagine, and this continued in Indian history, all the kind of combinations, right? Also different peoples that came from very far away places that fought at a point together. Here we see a pretty patched list, sort of, possible material as well that was used for this kind of armor. In particular, again, we don't have to think that there were enormous capacities of standardization or uniformation, but the Arthashastra is actually designed to sort of describe, to issue, ideally, because it's conceived also as a sacred text of some kind in any case, because the ruler was sacred. So it was describing the ideal order, right, established, affirmed by him, to provide, in fact, extensive amount of arms and armor from, say, imperial armories, local, and Chandragupta backed in particular the cities, also the Buddhist influences. So there is a specific type of military mentality. We can imagine, however, overall, that artistic license aside, Indians fought also in pretty similar ways, as we said at the beginning. They were relatively homogenized. There could be some variations in detail, but overall, you can't draw too many boundaries, right? Ethnically, in some fringe areas, yes, you can say there were some peoples that, as think about how Herodotus lists how the various subjects of the Achaemenid Empire that arrived up to the Sindh, as a matter of fact, were equipped and were Indians, for example, invading Greece together with Darius and Xerxes. In any case, they would have been fairly basic, as we understood, which also made it easier for them to be quote-unquote uniform. they wouldn't probably even see it in that way because it was already like that. Specific varieties of this armor include a full body coat of mail covering from head to foot, interestingly enough, almost medieval, right? Including the hands, right? This is a type of armor you see, in fact, from medieval times as well into the modern age and in many parts in Europe. But the fact that it's described here also for India is quite fascinating. If you look at the Dura Europos frescoes, as you know, the Roman military at some point you use something similar, right? We can imagine all this type of combinations. A two-piece coat protecting the head, hump, and arms as well was used, and a lion cloth-like armor. Yes, because animal skins did, if properly also treated, provide with minimal defense. Again, leather armor did exist. It had some general purpose. Consider that Indian warfare is overall relatively light as far as individuals are concerned, because massive resources are concentrated. But there are also many people, so the former are diluted on the latter. Other protective gear included sirastrana, the hand protection. These are the terms, again, from the Indian text. Kantatrana, the neck protection. Kimpasa, the trunk covering. Kankuka, a jacket to the knees. Varavana, jacket to the heels. Pata, an upper garment. And Nagodarka, the finger protecting gloves. Right? We've seen before as well for archery, but not only. Shields were also diverse, such as the Pathi made of creepers, Karma or Resumendaka, leather possibly for palm protection, to hold the bridle, right, either on horseback or on a chariot, not for elephants, those you controlled in different ways, like the elephants of Lord of the Rings. Have a talamula, that is wood, perhaps palmyra. Bamanika reed, kavata, door panel-like, kitika, hide or bamboo, a pratyatha, used in elephant fights, interestingly enough, and valakanta, that is leather or bamboo with iron fringes. Right, so you have obviously a pretty wide assortment. This kind of variety would have actually existed also pretty much elsewhere, right? Here, again, the source is also more descriptive. What is interesting, especially in sort of in armor, is this almost medieval coverage, right? That speaks perhaps of that bit of knightly bias remaining. You have this leather palm protection with even like mittens with the separated finger. This is something admittedly very, or covering fingers, at least that is something very advanced for the time. This kind of stuff did exist. Again, there was already some importantly developed armor elsewhere. And here we're looking not just at a wide range of territories, but also a fairly deep time. These sources were written in a way that consolidated traditional modes and fashions. So it was important from an encyclopedical, ecumenic standpoint to list everything that existed. But then, again, practice would have looked a bit different and a bit simpler. War elephants and horses were equipped with trappings and ornaments. With the Sukraniti, later Niti text on politics and warfare describing iron leaf like plates for the body and trunk, and iron nails with sharp edges for finger protection. Right? Indian armor for elephants was really a thing. Also, much later times, one of my earliest videos was about the Mughal armored elephant, as a matter of fact. Asuras, or demon warriors, so the chthonic, the divine, the sort of titanic figures, again challenging the Apollonian heroes in epic and Puranic literature, wore naturally a deteriorator type of armor, more tied to not to noble metals, but to, again, more chthonic and weaker, more and humbler, like sort of less prestigious armor, made of elephant or antelope skins and tree bark even. And this would have actually been the case, where you can just imagine when the Europeans enter India, what that would have looked like actually, what kind of populations they would have encountered. However, in spite of all this pretty wide type of evidence, like the prevalence of armor in ancient India remains uncertain due to discrepancies between literary and artistic evidence. Naturally, we don't have to think at all that the majority of warriors wore armor, unless we look at sort of, depending on, we look at two in particular, like fighters in general could have been also people that pressed from the rear rank or whatever for psychological effect. Padded armor might have been slightly more spread than we think. Then obviously, even these enormous masses of Indian infantry would have been led by better troops in the front ranks. There would have been some picked units as a whole, again, some gradation like that. The majority of infantry was unarmored, and that's why we created another historical military unit episode for it. While the epics and Arthashastra suggest widespread use, because they mostly talk about heroes, as we've seen early Indian art, such as at Sanchi, so the one we're basing our soldiers here off of, the renowned Buddhist stupa complex in Madhya Pradesh, dating primarily to the 3rd century BC under Ashoka, with later expansions, by the way, featuring intricate stone reliefs depicting Yataka tales, processions, and historical scenes. They're very similar. Again, the Indian art is, in any case, aside from time, very conservative. Rarely depicts armor, right? We see actually lots of naked troops and figures in general. Even for when you look at chariot and elephant warriors, who are typically the nobles and leaders, there isn't that great display of armor instead. So first of all, there's a discrepancy between literary tradition, narratives, and iconography, right? If you look at, Hellenic art, at some point we talk about hoplites, we see that, for example, heroic nudity was a thing that we know from literary sources like Xenophon's, for example, that sort of troops were much better equipped. In general, check that video made about Athenian cavalry, where we see, again, iconographical this naked heroes, and then Xenophon talks about some veritable knightly equipment, right? So this should be explained in ways that have to do with sort of the target of this type of text. Iconography was more generally accessible. Texts were sort of more the property of the elite, so there may be a divide between the two things, something more sort of appealing to the elite in terms of arms and armor description, as opposed to general iconography that represented also a relatively less ferocious face of these warriors, perhaps even for sort of public order. I'm just sort of speculating at this point, but just for telling you how this could be for different reasons. Naturally, the large masses of Indian peasantry were largely disarmed, right? This is true not just in the countryside by the aristocracy, but also in the cities. The cities had guilds, they had militias. It's something that, say, at the time of Ashoka, of course, all these masses were dangerous in general. There was police, there was general control of the population. Ashoka passes for the great liberal leader that was religiously tolerant, but he actually carried out some terrible massacres against political and religious opponents alike by means of Buddhists, by the way. So that's quite interesting as well. And so it was actually a mess, and you would imagine that even simple militias were fairly sort of, if not experienced, but in any case, they were sort of close to this type of violence on a more or less regular basis, and levies also. Think about the countryside, how many raids were carried out habitually. So it's a very interesting picture, but for the same reason, we also the organization, in cases, many historical indicators, we know that the masses were largely dispossessed. They did not properly belong to the order to begin with, because foretastators were not considered people, as a matter of fact. And they could have, in this sense, not even theoretically fought, Now, one rare Sanchi representation shows, and I inserted here prominently, soldiers with bows and short spoon-bladed swords, wearing armor of 5 leather bands. We think it's leather, right? Possibly the yalika or headless armor of the Arthashastra, covering the lower torso but leaving the upper bare, right? So here I actually represented it as metal, as a matter of fact, which would have surely existed in some forms. I can't still in time to add something leather as well, but in any case, right? And the weapon makes sense because some of these guys, again, use also bows, etc. They're not particularly heavily armored, so even against one another as champions, so to say, we see them assaulting the enemy fortress in the iconography, would have really chopped lots of people to pieces if this were the better armored guys that we see in Indian iconography. These were the ones that in theory should have had an easier time getting to the fray and killing more people because they were better armored, right? But naturally things get complicated at that level of combat. If anything, we can imagine they were more skilled, right? We see even some guy with a shield of the type that we have discussed also in the with the same, on the basis of the same source, by the way, for the lighter type of troops, because there are the same guys with this shield with the curved top and the flat bottom, both with this leather bands or without, right? And that would be literally the difference between the two historical unit types that we're describing here, because they're otherwise really the same. Also, the bow is used with, I don't remember if there are literal depictions of guys that have the sword together with the bow as well, but it sort of seems obvious also because these weapons are so prominent in among all the other troopers. So that's actually very interesting. We can see this as a form of naturally deep protection around the abdomen. It is also it's the same concept of the segmented armor of the Romans, right? Except that also had segments on the shoulders, etc. But there are other types of armor that actually show, in particular, just that level of protection, and they could be again also assembled in different ways, right? Surely different fighters got their armor from sort of different sources. The abdomen naturally can be more vulnerable. There are no bones to protect you frontally. Like, actually, the human body is very fragile. Like, leather armor will not spare you from, let's say, but from cats in particular, it could be minimally helpful. Then here we could even assume that this armor was actually metal, right? It would have been incredibly expensive. We have to consider this aspect, not just in general for the ancient world, but for India in particular, right? And again, this is only what we see in the iconography. As we said, actually, the Arthashastra distinguishes the so-called armored men from archers, implying that the former were likely javelinmen of some sort. Here we see swordsmen, as a matter of fact. But we don't have any better explanation, but there doesn't even need to be in practice, because these troops would use also different type of weapons at the same time. Like, javelin can be used as a spear, depending on the types. But if you see a sword or a spear, in these images as well, like, you have a broader and probably even fairly accurate way of sort of depicting this or categorizing the soldiers. Like, the stupa may be again indicative of some sort of styles or whatever, but in general, the essence of those troops, like, sort of makes sense. You would imagine Indian armies at this point to look something very similar to this. Now, Hellenic accounts, unbound by Indian artistic or literary conventions, provide valuable insight. However, they confirm that kings like Poros, the Paurava ruler of the region between the Jhelum and Kenab rivers, who famously opposed Alexander the Great at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326, with a large force, including war elephants, wore armor. right? Porus was also on the elephant, as a matter of fact. We also covered that numismatic iconography in the video about the Xystophoroi, and also partly in the video about Alexander's panoply. And so that makes sense in any case, because leaders would be better armored. And Hellenic sources describe Porus' armor as a tough, closely fitting corselet decorated with gold, leaving only the right shoulder exposed, by the way, which sort of partially aligns with what we see here, right? The idea that the shoulder could be exposed because the regular type of armor was born in India had this sort of lighter bias that we see also in the Sanchi stupa, as a matter of fact. And the idea is that, by the way, this arm would have been needed for movements that required big deal of for throwing javelins, for example, from elephant. Again, the idea of throwing darts is very much present in the Vedic idea of the hero striking the goal, the objective. Hellenic sources also make no mention of armor for ordinary soldiers, even high-standing mercenaries like those of the Assakenoi who use javelins and shields but lacked armor, according to Theodorus at least, right? So this could, again, these are not categorical definitions. Ancient sources did not reason in those terms. You can have, especially in the wake of Herodotus, right? It sort of gave, the Greeks behaved like this. They gave this basic description. Those troops used this and that weapon. Naturally, they were intelligent enough. It's mostly like the modern mind that does not understand this. That giving that basic information kind of gave an idea to the reader of what kind of trooper they were. Like if you talk about javelins, it's obvious that you can't have an elite that throws javelins that also wears armor, but at large are going to be some sort of medium cavalry in terms of equipment. And they would have had secondary weapons that would have used this javelins also as spears, depending on how it depends. Like some spears were more spears like, and some javelins were more javelins like, but in between typologically. And so it's obvious that some of them would have had armor, right? Would have had even just helmets, if we categorize that as armor as well, as opposed to simply body armor. But the question is, did those Hellenic sources need to tell us? No, didn't make any sense. Also, most troops in the world at the time did not wear a big deal of armor to begin with, right? So it was probably not even that interesting to specify. And it turns out that when you acquire some sort of sensitivity to this historiographical practice, you start realizing that after all these stereotypical descriptions at the end of the day fit pretty much into a broader pattern that turns out to be particularly accurate, right? These ethnographic discourses attributing this weapon in combination with another substitute to a people as opposed to another does actually make a lot of sense in a broader picture, considering the countries, what the political and social structures were, the cultural influences, etc., military-wise. Megasthenes, the Hellenic ambassador sent by Seleucus I Nicator to the court of Chandragupta Maurya himself around 300 BC, whose Indica provides one of the earliest foreign ethnographic descriptions of Indian society, importantly enough, because the Seleucids had very strong connections with the Indians that also provided them with lots of elephants for that matter. We'll talk more about this. Administration and military organization also does not describe Mauryan soldiers using armor, suggesting it was scarce, right? And epic references may reflect in this sense just poetic convention, but especially a hyper focus on the elite and, again, the metaphorical meaning of precious metal armors. The armored infantry and cavalry in the Arthashastra might have been rare or from a later period, right? So, because these, again, are sources that sometimes were even retouched. We don't know exactly like the entire philological history of them. We barely know who the authors were, to whom they were attributed. in any case, it's more like a spectrum, a chronological about, right? Whereabout. Now, the development of armor also reflects broader advancements in metallurgy and warfare. Last year I made a video in this regard, and in primitive times, as seen in the Ramayana, monkey tribes used stones and trees as weapons. During the Chalcolithic period, we are obviously at the dawn on everything, roughly 3000 to 1500 BC, across various regions of the Indian subcontinent characterized by the use of copper and stone tools alongside early agricultural settlements, and evidenced by sites like those in the Indus Valley Civilization and Rig Vedic Samhita. Copper and bronze superseded stone, though stone weapons persist. So never underestimate how poor the French really was. Right, so by the common ear. The Ayurveda period associated with ritual texts composed after the Rig Veda and linked to the introduction and spread of iron technology in northern India around 1000 BC onward marked the introduction also of iron, which became more valuable in the sense it was more expandable than bronze for arms and armor. As you know, bronze armor survived even during the Middle Ages. On average, it's more qualitative, right? And iron spreads because sort of civilizations had more troops to armor at a sort of basic level, whereas collective training was actually escalating, so you didn't need hyper expensive armor like before. Gold and silver were used for their ornamental and plastic properties, crafting arrows, shields, and other defenses. Ceremonial and not, right? It's not like everything that is expensive has gold or whatever. No, this was not used in battle. Actually, were properly used in battle. Like if the weapon maintains the same level of ergonomy or properly combat expendability, unless that changes, because it can happen. There are some ceremonial weapons because they're not properly designed to be used in combat. They were used, and they were actually that important on a psychological, spiritual, religious ground, and we tend to forget that as moderns in many ways. Now, by the time of Alexander's invasion and Megasthenes' observations, iron sword and throwing spears had replaced simpler bamboo and sago palm javelins with straight two-handed swords becoming prominent, later seen in the bas-relief at Angkor Wat. When armor became more common in Kushan art, right, of the 1st century AD, I made a video about the Kushan Empire that ruled parts of northern India and Central Asia, and is known for its syncretic Hellenic Buddhist sculpture and coinage. It often resembled Kushan lamellar styles, likely, however, not reflective of earlier Indian designs, but possibly as well, because the question is, where does the segmented armor come from? Right? Mostly Central Asian armor was lamellar, in fact. And so in this sense, yes, they could be different, but the concept of having some broader bands that enclose you was probably not so alien after all. It's not like a people has just a type of armor, the other doesn't, right? It also has to do with what kind of opponents you face. And there were different injection of sagas in India. So again, if you're interested in Kushan warfare, I made an entire video about that, and you can sort of appreciate the context. However, kilted armor with pteryges, possibly I inserted, in fact, here in one of the two guides that I used with AI, that is perfectly adherent to evidence, possibly influenced by Hellenic styles from the 2nd century BC, but possibly even earlier, may align with the Arthashastra's padded cotton. At the same time, a king's armor in the Mahabharata described as, quote, decked with 100 suns, 100 circles, 100 spots, and 100 eyes. That is obviously a metaphorical idea of sort of providence, at least in terms of sort of what even this other local monarchs that could be a sum, in fact, of different retinues and monsters. We've seen aspects of this also in Gaelic culture. Recalls the later Mughal coat of thousand eyes, a studded brigandine suggesting kilted armor reinforced with studs. Right? It obviously had a stellar meaning, right, to them. Thus, while armor was varied and sophisticated in literary descriptions, its actual use in early India appears limited in any case, evolving significantly with metallurgical and cultural advancements. Additional context on materials and regional variations further illustrates how armor adapted to local resources and threats. In the Vedic hymns, protective gear often blended symbolic and functional elements with references to varman, indicating body coverings that could range from woven fabrics to early metallic links, reflecting the transition from pastoral warrior societies to more organized polities. Epic narratives frequently embellish armor with divine or heroic attributes such as invulnerability, granted by celestial intervention, or simply reflecting it, because apotropic symbolism is not really, okay, I wear this and, God simply protects me. No, the point was to find a consonance. This could be sort of precious metal armor or tattoos, right? We find them all across the world. It's what they had and more or less function in practical terms, but the idea is that you were manifesting in the world, and therefore, on the basis of your virtue, aligned with cosmic harmony, thus receiving the Holy Ghost, as we have overly and overwhelmingly documented from a radically exponential amount of information from any type of ancient theological source, from any religion, from any people. Yet, these accounts also hint at practical concerns like weight and mobility in the hot Indian climate. This is a bit of a stretch. I mean, it is true. We've seen it also in the Middle Ages in the Holy Land. It seems that there was some lighter type of equipment. But people say, well, it's climate because it was hot. Indeed, also in Northern Europe, in summer, you get cooked in an armor, or at least it can be definitely difficult and uncomfortable to fight under the sun. You just exhaust yourself in many different ways. But you also have to think of primarily, the first reason is political, social, right? If you are fighting against lots of lightly armored troops, because these people are not properly even people, as we said before, and they they have some elementary equipment. Well, at that point, you also change that kind of force. It's like the same Crusaders in the Holy Land. They had to fight the Turks, right? That had just a few hyper elite armored horsemen, but the vast majority of their forces were unarmored horsemen. So you adapt yourself, right? Surely the Indian climate is complicated, is also really tough in many cases. And their heavy metal plates might prove cumbersome compared to lighter kilter or leather options, but it's never quite about that. If you have to be protected, you will use that protection, even if you're dying in it. All right. So when you look at artistic sources, this iconographic evidence, always think this in context, because it's, again, licentious in the artistic sense. The Arthashastra's emphasis on state-controlled production of armor underscores its role in centralized military logistics, obviously, with workshops likely producing standardized pieces for royal forces, particularly in the cities, some of which were pretty big, while regional chieftains relied on locally sourced horn and hide armors suited to forested or hilly terrains. This is very stereotypical. Again, they would have had basically both things at the same time. They were quite blended, telling you the truth, but tendentially, by extremes, right, this is plausible. In artistic evidence like this one from Buddhist sites like Sanchi reveals a preference for depicting unarmored or lightly protected troops. In ceremonial or narrative scenes, possibly to emphasize spiritual rather than martial prowess, or because everyday infantry wore minimal protection that artists omitted for stylistic reasons. Foreign observers like the Greeks, accustomed to hoplite panoply and phalanx formations, highlighted the contrast in Indian tactics that favored mobility, archery, and elephant charges over heavily armored infantry lines, noting how Porus's forces combined disciplined elephant units with lighter foot soldiers. This is kind of obvious. Like, the Indians didn't have any of the European political and social backbone of freemen. Doesn't matter whether the Pizzatari were de facto proletarians. Still, by European standards, we've seen it also with the Mauryan legionaries, is that these were individually sort of expensive people compared to the average Indian, all right? And the heavy infantries of Europe were the ones that had taken over the entire world, like the Achaemenid Empire. They arrived up to India. So it's probably a different type of warfare. Again, heavy infantry would have been the same, but the Indians compensated for lower quality with greater quantity, which also entails, by the way, massive logistical and tactical capacity, collective training to an extent. Not always big armies mean collective training, as a matter of fact. But that's also how the Indians could fight against one another. For example, large masses of cheaply trained forces to throw at one another, because in terms of sheer force, that's what you could more readily available throw at the enemy without needing time and resources to train them, when numbers can simply overwhelm, right? So this is the picture also we get from the Westerners, and that's actually not wrong. All right, it's also like what happens during the Kushan Empire. You have cataphracts, combined armed tactics against, again, an Indian tradition. It was a might to reckon. Like, it wasn't really an ineffective system, but it was because it was big and internally softer, right? It's so even peoples like from Central Asia that were not particularly numerous at a point could take over this vast Indian subcontinent with, for example, heavy cavalry dominance. I don't say combined armed tactics because, yes, they were there, but also the Indians used them for that matter. In any case, every conqueror in India ended up taking on like the local fighting styles. We've seen it really as almost as a constant in Indian warfare, right? Until they got westernized in a way in very later times. So we've seen it with the Mughals, we've seen it with every conqueror, with the Arabs that arrived there. And it is indeed very fascinating. So over time, external influences from Hellenistic kingdoms after Alexander and later Central Asian groups like the Kushans introduced scale and lamellar constructions that gradually integrated with indigenous padded and mail traditions, paving the way for more robust protections in medieval periods. At the same time, you find this segmented abdominal armor that seems to have been a thing and makes sense in the broader picture. We explained how, more or less. It's not the best, but there was in fact surely much heavier stuff. This is just from the Sanchi Stupa. That is essentially the best iconographic source for the period, overall, how an Indian army would look like. And so overall, if you look at this from a apological point of view and from a military, historical, and cultural point of view, this layered development highlights how armor in ancient India was not a uniform technology, but a dynamic response to environmental, social, tactical demands, with literary sources preserving idealized visions, while archaeology and foreign testimonies ground the reality of selective and evolving use. So this is actually what we can say about it. Then this guy, you've seen the pictures in the video, you would have understood immediately what kind of enemy you would find in front of you. Then we'll talk more and better about things like Indian archers, because there are a bunch of quite interesting Indian units that are, for this series, that are conjecturally expandable for the channel's purposes, right? So this is a very good very good way to look at the various videos. Here for ancient India, it is mostly about, well, I expanded a bit with history of religion, but oh, come on. Only 8 videos. This is the 9th. Yeah, Kushan warfare. We talked a bit about the Guptas as well, but in a general sort of late antique sense. And we talked in general about some very old videos. I can't remember, those were so old. But they received views. People, generally speaking, like the stuff. And again, it's good to expand this content in a way that is ever more complete, but also reliable, because obviously quality increases over time. And we are overall, I have actually still some videos to make about medieval India. Many more, telling the truth. But from last year, we actually started properly talking about medieval India, because we completed like our introduction in Mughal warfare with cavalry, infantry, artillery, etc. But we barely talked about any medieval stuff. Just we talk about flags, we talk about some cavalrymen from the 15th century, but there is plenty of units in between that I think are incredibly important, obviously, to cover. And more or less we go on like this. It's good. I presumably this playlist do not get too many views, because Indian content, for some reason, people don't watch it. But overall, I'd say that, if you look at the Indian history here, considering the scarcity of videos and generally also the views they receive, overall, it's not so bad, right? And so we are attracting more interest. I don't have many views from India as far as I recall, but there are. And so Schwerpunkt has been expanding. People are, generally speaking, appreciative. People who are really interested in military history of this kind of focus, right? Because most people don't see the point. They think that my channel is just like an identitarianist channel. And you don't need any ism to be a traditional channel, as a matter of fact. And if you reject like the knowledge of the universe, it's a bit complicated for anyone to sort of to embrace tradition in this regard. People, again, are at this point just programmed to not to know, to presume that knowing nothing is now the standard they can use, not to feel challenged about themselves. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.